On a lonely ridge in the Wild West, a man named Thomas Brennan lived like a ghost. Grief had hollowed him out. He'd buried his wife, Sarah, and the child they never got to meet. For 3 long months, he hadn't spoken a single word to another soul. His cabin stood silent, filled only with shadows and the echo of memories. But one cold evening, that silence shattered. A tiny face appeared at his window. Copper curls, green eyes, the very eyes that had haunted his dreams. Thomas whispered to the empty room, his voice breaking, "She looks like my wife." Then came the knock. A desperate widow, starving, clutching her little girl. And when that child wrapped her arms around his leg, calling herself by the very name carved on his daughter's grave, Thomas knew life was about to demand something of him he thought he'd never give again. But what happens when a broken man is forced to choose between the safety of solitude and the dangerous hope of love reborn? If this story already has your heart pounding a little, stick with us. We've got courage, sacrifice, and the kind of love that only the Wild West could forge. Don't forget to hit like, tap subscribe, and share this with someone who loves a good story. It helps more than you know, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Thomas Brennan's cabin stood like a scar against the ridge. Wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the sound of loneliness, a sound Thomas had grown too familiar with. Just 3 months earlier, he had buried his wife, Sarah, and the unborn child they'd both dreamed of. He dug the graves himself beneath the oak tree, his calloused hands blistered, his heart splintered beyond repair. Since then, silence had been his only companion. Days blurred into one another. He fixed fences that didn't need fixing. He chopped wood he would never burn. Anything to keep from thinking. Anything to keep from remembering Sarah's laughter in the kitchen or how she'd rested her hand on her rounded belly, talking about the future that never came. Neighbors stopped calling long ago. He wanted it that way. Connection meant risk, and risk meant pain. He told himself he was done with the world, that solitude was safer than hope. But deep down, Thomas knew the truth. He wasn't living. He was hiding. And sometimes, when the night grew too quiet, he swore he could still hear Sarah's voice on the wind. What he didn't know was that life was about to come knocking. The first sound was faint, soft knuckles against the wood. Thomas froze, axe still in hand, heart hammering in his chest. Nobody came this far up the ridge. Not anymore. He thought it might be the wind. But then came the second knock, sharper, urgent. When he opened the door, the sight before him nearly buckled his knees. A woman stood there, pale and trembling, her black dress tattered like it had seen 100 storms. In her arms, she clutched a worn carpet bag, and beside her stood a little girl. The child pressed her palms against his leg, copper curls spilling over her face, green eyes wide and unblinking. Sarah's eyes. Thomas whispered, almost to himself, "She looks like my wife." The widow swayed, her voice weak. "Please, my daughter. We haven't eaten in 2 days." Then her knees gave out and Thomas caught her before she fell, her body light as dried leaves. The girl clung tighter to him as though she had known all along this was where she was meant to be. "Emma," she whispered when he asked her name. Emma. The very name carved on the headstone beside Sarah's grave. By morning, the cabin no longer felt like a tomb. A small fire crackled in the hearth. Emma curled against Thomas's side, breathing steady after a meal of soup he'd scraped from dwindling supplies. For the first time in months, warmth, something like hope, touched the room. But hope has a way of drawing danger. Dust rose on the horizon, 6 riders thundering straight for the ridge. Thomas's instincts stirred, sharp and unwelcome. He hadn't carried a rifle since his rangering days, but old habits came rushing back like a storm. Mary, the widow, stirred from fever, panic flooding her eyes the moment she heard the hoofbeats. "They found us," she whispered, clutching Emma tight. "I stole her." Thomas stared, not sure he'd heard right. Mary's voice cracked as she confessed. After her husband's death, his brother had tried to claim Emma, not out of love, but to pay gambling debts. She couldn't let that happen. She ran. And now, The men outside had come to take the child back. Through the window, Thomas saw the sheriff's badge glinting on the lead rider's chest. But the men beside him weren't lawmen. They looked like wolves dressed as sheepdogs, and they wanted Emma. The sheriff's voice carried across the yard, sharp and commanding. "Brennan, we know you've got stolen property in there. Send out the woman and the child and we'll be on our way." Stolen property? They spoke of Emma as though she were cattle, not flesh and blood. Thomas felt something stir inside him. A cold, dangerous fire he hadn't let burn in years. The part of him that once knew how to fight. Mary's hands trembled. "They'll kill me. And Emma? God only knows." The child pressed into Thomas's side, silent but shaking. She had already learned too young how to make herself small. That night, as stars bled across the sky, Thomas found Emma by Sarah's grave. Her tiny fingers traced the carved name as she asked, "Is this your little girl?" His throat closed. "She would have been," he whispered. Emma studied the smaller stone, the one that bore her own name. Then she looked up with the wisdom of a child who'd seen too much. "Mama cries at night. Will those men hurt her?" Thomas drew a long breath. "Not if I can help it." The decision was made. At dawn, he would stand his ground. Dawn rose blood red over the ridge. Thomas stood on the porch, rifle balanced easy in his hands, every line of his body steady. The sheriff and his hired men formed a half circle, confidence dripping from their smirks. "Where's the woman and child?" the sheriff demanded. "Gone," Thomas answered simply. It wasn't quite a lie. Mary and Emma crouched in the root cellar, ready to follow the deer trail if gunfire broke. The standoff snapped like dry tinder. Guns barked, smoke filled the air, and when the echoes faded, 3 men lay still in the dirt. The survivors dragged their wounded away, realizing too late that Thomas Brennan was not a man to corner. When Mary and Emma emerged, eyes wide with fear and awe, Thomas made an offer that surprised even himself. "Stay. Build something here. Start over." Mary's tears shone in the morning light. "We can't ask that of you." "You're not asking," Thomas said. "I'm offering." Emma tugged his sleeve, her voice small but sure. "Will you teach me to read the names on the stones?" "Every letter," Thomas promised. And for the first time, the ridge felt less like a graveyard and more like home. In the years that followed, the lonely cabin on the ridge transformed. Neighbors who once avoided it began to hear laughter ringing across the valley. Mary tending her garden, Emma growing tall and strong, and Thomas teaching children to read beneath the old oak. Visitors never knew the whole truth, how salvation came to Thomas in the shape of a starving widow and her daughter. How love, once buried, rose from the ashes of grief. And if you ever stood there at dusk, you'd see the way Emma called him Papa with pride, and the way Thomas looked back, fierce with the love of a father reborn. Because sometimes family isn't given, sometimes it's forged in fire and choice and in love that refuses to die.